My name's Jeff Herod, and I'm going to talk about a suite of other aquatic invasive species that are found in Kentucky. So I'm going to talk about different species, where these species are found, where these species come from. I'm going to share with you a little bit about where I get my information in case you would like to look some of the information up yourself. So talking about data sources, so where do I get my information from? So first off, I have the websites, the U.S. Geological Survey Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. That's the website right there. I use this website. You can get a lot of different information from it. If you go here, you can set up and log in and get alerts for species. So you get by species that you want or by state, and they'll just push out emails to give you those alerts. Currently in Kentucky, we only have 126 subscribers. So that's why I'm kind of bringing this to your attention, that this is a nice way to kind of recreate on a rainy day, to go to this database and look up records in Kentucky. What you're going to find basically are going to be profiles of different species. There's maps for the species, tools that talk about how the species are spread or where they could be spread, as well as different records. So if you're really interested, you can look at a specific record for a specific individual, for a specific species in Kentucky, and see what the source of that record is. I also am a big fan of iNaturalist. This is citizen science at its best. If you have not added an app to your phone, go ahead and add this iNaturalist. If you have a profile, you would look for projects, and under projects we have a Kentucky Aquatic Nuisance Species, ANS. So you can go in there and actually look this up. What you're going to find is a suite of information. This is a picture of my profile from my phone, the project ANS. If you look at ANS, I had a biologist that works for me set this up. Over 2,500 records. We have 61 species, over 1,100 people contributing to this right now. This has only been up and running for 1 year. So I'm encouraging folks, if you have this on your phone, you go out hiking, you go fishing, just turning over rocks in a creek. If you have this app, you can take pictures of things you see. Maybe you have questions about them, or if it's something that you think is unusual, take a picture of it. You can load it to iNaturalist. This right here is an example of giant salvinia. So we had a person who works with the Friends of Lands Between the Lakes. Her name is Annabelle Barr. She was out walking and she found this plant material along the shoreline in Fenton, right on the shoreline, right there by the bridge. Did not know what the material was. Took a picture of it, took 3 pictures. This is the most telling one. It's hard for you guys to see, but there's little hairs underneath these leaves. Makes it very unique. It's in a very specific group of plants. But what I got was an alert that sent this picture to me that I was able to go through and say, well, I know exactly what I think that is. And I actually met with Annabelle. We went out, we went to the site, and I collected 2-gallon freezer bags full of material. I was able to confirm that is giant salvinia. It's the first record we have in the state of Kentucky. It's the only location that we know. This plant is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it later on, it's freeze tolerant in large mats. It can survive here. So now I'm kind of on the lookout. I've been going to boat ramps looking for more material. But this is exactly what iNaturalist was set up to do, is to trigger that, give me a map, a location, and also a contact person to get a hold of when I find something. I also use, and these are pretty heavy scientific documents, but they have a lot of really good material. These are called ecological risk screening summaries. They're produced by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a library of these. All kinds of different species are in there. If you're a person who has different types of tropical fish or has a water garden, you can probably go and look up and see if this plant species you have, if there's any kind of risk involved with those. These ecological risk screening summaries, I use them for is to look for species that have a climate match between the donor area and the state of Kentucky. as well as do they have a history of invasiveness anywhere else in the world? And then are there any kind of documented negative impacts? So I get a lot of material. I'm going to take all three of these pieces, I'm going to put them together as we go through this talk and illustrate what I'm doing with for some of these species in Kentucky. So let's talk a little bit about species. So USGS. So we contribute a lot of data to the USGS, non-indigenous aquatic species database. And they were able to go ahead and generate in 2025 a specific report for Kentucky, just for me. And it came up with almost 7,000 records, 131 unique taxa, and many of those taxa there were more than 100 records for. I use the word taxa, not species, so I want to just pause there for a second. Think about 131, they could be an individual species, a subspecies, a variety, or even a ploidy level. So an example of this is, in the USGS database, if they had grass carp, they could have a record for a grass carp that is diploid, which means that it could reproduce. They may also have a record for a grass carp that is triploid, which means that it's sterile. In the database, it counts those as two different taxa. Whereas if I were just talking to you about like how many fish do we have, I'd say 70 species. I would group it all together regardless of the ploidy level. So I'm going to use taxa throughout this. When I'm still slicing up some of the numbers, but we're about 125 to 127 true unique species that have been found over time in Kentucky. Talking about the 7,000, almost 7,000 records. If you look at the invasive carp, Josh just talked a lot about the carp. Over 3,800 of those 7,000 records are silver carp, about 600 for grass, about 500 for bighead. It's not because these species are very common or widespread. It's because Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources has focused its management on these species. So we're contributing a lot of information on these species. I would imagine most of you know the common carp. They're probably more widespread than 52 locations in the entire state of Kentucky. So as I go through this, we're going to talk about records and locations, and you can't directly compare apples to oranges because the effort isn't consistent across all taxa. So what we look for when I'm going through these records is the history of invasiveness. So when it was introduced into Kentucky and how long between records, and then again, how many watersheds did the species show up over time. And that's how I kind of look at these. So I mentioned there's 130 unique taxa. Down here I have, these are years. So from 1875 is the first record all the way to 2025. We have from 0 species, so pre-1875, up to 131 species. I gave you an example of in 1896 is the first documented record we have for purple loosestrife in Kentucky. And as I mentioned, in December of 2025, giant salvinia is first detected. In this area where I've circled in green, this is where we had a rapid increase in a number of species. So between 1980 to 2025, in that 45-year period, we had 56 species that showed up, which is a rate of a little bit more than one species per year. What do these species look like? Primarily fish, about 70 species, 31 species of plant. So there's 100 out of the 131 taxa. Just in those two groups. We do have some crayfish species, certain bivalves, so zebra mussel, corbicula, and then some snails. So 131 taxa. We know that we have an increasing rate of introduction. So where do these species come from? So in this box right up here, I pulled out the top 3, what we call donor areas in the country, and I've broken that information out over here. So basically the donor locations are areas where the species are native, and then they show up in Kentucky, and so we call them a donor area. North America has the highest number of species that show up in Kentucky with about 68. Asia's next with 24, Eurasia's 18, and then South America, this is directly from the USGS report. This actually moves up to 10. Giant salvinia is a South American plant. So if you went through those top three, that's 84% of all the aquatic invasive species. So we have a pattern we're starting to see. If we were to look, that looks really jumbled. If you were to look at just aquatic invasive plants, it looks a little bit different in the trend. Eurasia has 14% or 14 species, about 47% of the species. South America has 5. This is updated for the giant salvinia, and Asia has 4. So you still see the top 2 donor out of the top 3. You just don't see North America when it comes to aquatic invasive plants. That's what's been shifted. So we know where the donor areas are. We know there's 131 tax. We know we're increasing over time. So where are species found in Kentucky? So in this graphic, underneath here is Kentucky. These are 8-digit, what they call HUCs. These are watersheds. And so I don't look at these by county. I actually look by watershed for all aquatic invasive species. So we have 42 8-digit HUCs. If I look at just the top 3 for total number of aquatic invasive species, the lower Cumberland is 205, upper Cumberland 101, and the Licking 101. That ranges between 42 species to 30 species. So this is all taxa put together. So across Kentucky, we do see some patterns. We see some large numbers, but I wanted to highlight the saline. So for this particular watershed, we only have 2 aquatic invasive species, no aquatic plants here, Corbicula and the zebra mussel. So we see this across Kentucky. It's not equal that each watershed is going to have the same number of aquatic invasive species. It's not going to have necessarily the same number of taxa, so mussels or plants or fishes. It is very different across our state. So we're trying to figure out what does that spatial pattern look like over time. Flashing back to plants, as I just mentioned, I had 3 watersheds I called out as the highest. These 2 right here for plants came out high as well. So it's the same watersheds. For the lower Kentucky, we had 42 total species. Of that, 11 were plants. 8 of those were for the licking. That was out of 30. And then we had a new arrival, the lower Lavissa, which is over here. What I want to draw your attention to also is we have lots of zeros for aquatic plants. Remember, there's only 31 aquatic invasive plants that have been introduced throughout history from 1875 to 2025. So we don't see a lot of aquatic plants in our commerce. We're not seeing a lot of those in hobbies. It's just something we're seeing as a pattern. We just don't have a lot of. So kind of recapping as we're going, 131 taxa, North America, Asia and Eurasia are the largest donor areas. We do see trends across the state. Some of these watersheds have very large numbers, as much as 42 species per watershed. Let's start to put some of this together. So I mentioned in the beginning that there were 6 taxa that had over 100 records. I showed you 3 of the invasive carp species that had well over 500 records. This is the scud. So this is an amphipod. This is the cover of the ecological risk screening summary I pointed out earlier. Within that, it shows a global distribution. So you can see parts of Europe, the Atlantic coast, and then this is pretty much the Ohio River area. This is what the critter looks like. It's about 1/4 of an inch in size. It has a very wide distribution. I expect in the future, taxonomists will split this species apart. You find it native into parts of Europe and the Rhine River, parts of North America, all up and down the entire Atlantic coast. For that small of a creature, I doubt that's all the same species, but for now, that's how we're treating it. That's how it's recognized. USGS, I mentioned they had maps. So this dark area here, this is all the records that are showing up for that species across the U.S. So it's been introduced the Ohio River and Illinois River. I mentioned earlier we have climate matching. So we look at a tool that says from its native range, how well could it match with parts of Kentucky and parts of the U.S.? As you can see, it aligns very well with this area of the country. The red and that really dark red, those are really high climate matches. If you get to the greens and blues, those are very low matches. I mentioned giant Sylvinia. So we have our first record, giant Sylvinia. So here we have the ecological risk screening summary. Here is where giant Sylvinia has been spread or recognized as being occurring across the entire globe. Now I mentioned its native range is southeast Brazil. So it has been spread all over. We have the USGS map. You can see all the dark colors. This is the areas introduced. Records in Kentucky. Earliest record, December 16th, 2025. Only one record, only one watershed. That's the only record we have. If you look at the climate matching, unfortunately, we have a really high match. They just changed up their model colors. This is your bar down here. Anything in that dark purple, that matched up with the reds and yellows. How many people know of an Oscar? Yes. So the Oscar is actually in Ecological Risk Screening Summary Library. This is all the records for Oscars across the globe. This is a South American Amazon River Basin, primarily species. Let's get there. As you can see, it has occurred, it's been documented in a lot of different watersheds across the U.S. Earliest record, 2024, Franklin County. I actually went to this site, Cove Spring. There's only one record of an Oscar ever being caught in the wild in Kentucky. Only one occurrence, one record. If you look at the climate match, you can see why. Very low match. We're down here now. You know, it's a tropical fish. It doesn't do well. And unfortunate story for this particular individual, our only record, is, here it is. It's at Cove Spring Park. This is a natural spring. So somebody thought they were doing the right thing. They released their pet that's tropical into spring water, which is like the 68 degrees. Instantly killed that. That's cold shock. Just killed the fish. So, you know, again, somebody thought they were doing the right thing. Didn't work out. But we have the record, and this is from iNaturalist. I got the alert. I was in Frankfurt. We went to the site. So, you know, this is, again, sort of pooling all these data points together from different sources. How many of you have ever heard of parrot feather? Yeah. So it's this kind of fluffy water garden kind of plant. You see it in some aquariums. Here's the ecological risk screening summary. Again, wide distribution globally. It shows up all over the place. This is a South American plant. You see this pattern with the aquatic plants? Most of these are coming from South America. And that aligns with what we're seeing for our historical records in Kentucky for aquatic invasive plants. That you see Eurasia, and then you're seeing South America are like the two top locations for the donor areas for these plants. If you were to look across the U.S., all the dark areas, this is everywhere that it's been found. If you look at climate match, most of the U.S. matches for this species, which aligns again with when you see East Coast, West Coast, and some of the upper parts of our northern latitude, the species has a pretty good match with most of North America. Earliest record, 1977, Harlan. We have 47 records in the database. It covers 14 watersheds, about 33% of our watersheds. The most recent record was February 11, 2023. Then I went to iNaturalist, and lo and behold, I have a new record, October 21st, 2025. So being able to check these different sources, I'm able to kind of better tell the story of what's happening in Kentucky. So how these plants get here. How many of you have ever heard of pathways? So the simplest way to explain this is that a species, in a particular aquatic species, can't really move from one place to another. They have to be moved. So how are they being moved? And in many cases, what we find is, you have trade, you have escape from aquaculture during flooding events, live bait, so at the end of the day, you have a bunch of shiners left over. Instead of taking them home, you dump them. Well, maybe they weren't all shiners. Maybe something else was in there. Hitchhikers, equipment that sits in the water and then moves around from place to place. A lot of houseboats are notorious for having all kinds of hitchhikers attached to them, as well as deliberate release. And in this category, you have, as well as stocking, so a management strategy of stocking something. But also, there are some religious groups that believe that in karma, that if you release species, it's going to bring you goodwill. And so we also see that. We also see people where an animal has just outgrown whatever container it has, and that species, they want to release it. They feel like it'd be better in the wild. That is absolutely the worst thing you can do. All of these species have been habituated to neutral climate. There's a heater in their tank. They've been hand-fed. They don't have predators in their tank or whatever it happens, and then they get released in the wild, and it's a very different story for most of them. In fact, like the Oscar, it probably didn't live but a few minutes being released into a spring. Just to kind of highlight this, I've taken the hitchhiker pathway, which is we have it loosely associated with about 23 species introductions in Kentucky, and then we put them across those 8-digit hucks, so we can actually start to focus in and target. So when you start looking at pathways, you're talking about different user groups, so your messaging changes from clean, drain, dry, or don't let it loose, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Release, the same thing, about 22. What we find is the most common pathway we have in our database right now is an unknown. And that's for a couple of different reasons. Some of these species, one I'm going to give you an example in a little bit, could be in a couple of different pathways, and so it's just unknown. And sometimes we really don't know how it got to wherever it's at. It's just not logical to follow that kind of thread of logic of how it got somewhere. But if you looked at released, it has a very similar pattern, but there are geographic differences. And again, we're using this information to build on campaigns and do outreach to folks on trying to slow the spread of some of these species. How many of you are familiar with zebra mussel? Yep. Zebra mussel came from the Black Caspian Seas. If you wanted to link this all the way back to our donor areas, that's Eurasia. If you looked at most of the carp, it's Eurasia, Asia. If you look at a lot of our species, this is where they're coming from. Kentucky record, earliest record, 1991, Marshall County. This is one of those species, over 100 records, 259 records. It's in 48 watersheds, and 2014 is the most recent record. How's this species move around? Encrusting on boats, anchors. How many of you have ever heard of a Marimo moss ball for aquariums? Yep. So there's these balls that have like a mossy algae to them. They're put in there as a biofilter and a substrate. Small shrimp and other invertebrates like to be able to hide in those. In 2024, I worked with law enforcement. There was a shipment that came to Kentucky. It was completely illegal. So these moss balls are harvested in the wild from Ukraine. which is in the area where we have zebra mussels, that Eurasian area of the world. Zebra mussels live on that substrate. What happened was APHIS PPQ has this quarantine on these mothballs when they come in, and they have to go through special protocols, which is like a chilling, almost freezing of the mothball. It doesn't hurt the plant, but it kills off invertebrates. And that way they can move it and then ship it, but that part of the quarantine is to eliminate anything else. This is actually a picture of a dead, gaping zebra mussel. But it moved through the pet trade. We got some in Kentucky. We went. Luckily, the notice went out that it is illegal to sell these because they bypassed their quarantine. They went from Ukraine, were shipped directly to Florida, and from Florida, a distributor then sent it out to 19 states. Luckily, most of those never made it out to be sold. They were bagged up and then destroyed. That's just one way it attached to substrates. In this particular organism, it also has a planktonic stage, so a larval stage that floats in the water. So it is also a hitchhiker through ballast water. So water taken on, if you fill the live well, it doesn't filter out small enough particles. It would bring zebra mussel veligers in. It then is moved or discharged into another water body. When the live well water starts to get a little bit stale, you dump the water out, you pick it up, but you're in a different body. And that's how the zebra mussel moves around. So this particular species has multiple life stages that are hitchhikers. So I talked a little bit about branding. And so what we're doing is we're looking at all these different pathways. We focus in on areas, and then we can target certain national campaigns. So, you know, don't dump your bait. These are crayfish they're dumping out. They're stop aquatic hitchhikers. How many of you ever heard don't let it loose? Okay. Usually, this got very popular in pet stores. I mean, usually you see the logos around, but they're basically all saying the same thing, is you have to be responsible. It doesn't end at the end of the day where you can just, you know, dump something or it gets too big, release it somewhere. That there's a responsible way to handle all of these, and there's ways that you can take care of these animals in a humane way, or you can also go ahead and now trade them back. So there are fish breeding groups and others that will take in certain species and not have you release it, because then it reflects poorly on that hobby as well. I mentioned clean, drain, dry. You know, Josh had mentioned before, like we go to boat shows, and so, you know, we talk to folks about different places on their boat and trailer where they can look, where there's pitch points where you may see aquatic plants, you may see zebra mussels, anything that is on that boat as you pull out that wasn't there before, you need to get rid of in that lake. Just put it right back in that lake or dispose of it in a trash can. And so we've been reaching out to folks. Our campaigns are a little bit further behind than other states. There are some states that actually have moved beyond the education part. Beyond the education part. There we go. And they now do what's called watercraft inspection decontamination, where they will certify your boat clean or dirty, and there can be a consequence to that. And so, you know, we're just trying to use straightforward education, talk to people and say, how can we prevent this? So in summary, 131 taxa, most are fish and plants, North America, Eurasia, and Asia. We do see different patterns geographically and through time in Kentucky. Stocking, hitchhiking, and release are our largest pathways for most species. Clean, drain, and dry. So there are these national campaigns out there that you can be part of. And then also, I would encourage you to join iNaturalist and look for the Kentucky ANS project. That is one location where you could be reporting things, and if you don't know what it is, getting feedback. But it also helps us. We get some information. So. With that, Josh is hiding back there, but we are going to take questions for both presentations. So thank you for listening. I won't hog it. So we got some questions. Yes, sir.
How close is the fish harvesting of all of the carp coming to putting the fish industry that's taking them out of business?
Good question. So the majority of the statewide harvest typically has occurred in Barclay, Kentucky reservoirs. And as I showed that our 2025 harvest numbers had decreased quite a bit from the previous year. We're seeing some shifting in efforts to other areas such as the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Some of these fish markets are more hungry than others. In particular, most of our harvested fish go to a fish meal and fish oil processor, and they have the ability to change their intake strategies and how they're operating their business, whereas some of the lesser industries, particularly like human consumption, those type of fisheries are more geared towards a really high-end care because they have a high level of intake quality that's necessary for those end products. I feel like there's just a lot of flexibility with those processors and fish buyers to be able to adapt to how our removal strategies are going to be changing in the future.
Where they're harvesting carp, freezing it, and shipping it to New England and East Coast for lobster bait, are we spreading it?
As far as spreading, those fish are deceased when they're shipped like that.
Yeah, I know.
However, they can be contributing to false environmental DNA detections. That would be a concern in some of those areas. There's also restrictions depending on where they're shipped to based on potential disease transfers. So in particular, if you're shipping to Maine, they will only take fish from certain parts of Kentucky because of the less likelihood of, I believe it is carp viremia. That's, yep.
CV something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
The plant invasions that was just found here in December 2025, what, it's going to be a dumb question.
No.
How does that pose a problem? You get to see just grow and take over the rivers or lakes or?
Yeah, so the question about giant salvinia,
We can't hear the question. Can you repeat the question?
the question was about giant salvinia. And so with giant salvinia, the question was like, so, what is the problem? What is it that we're worried about with giant salvinia? And so with giant salvinia, there's a couple of issues we're concerned about. So one is it has this behavior of growing in large mats. And I'm talking very large mats, like acres and acres. No, it's on the surface. And it covers acres and acres. Well, underneath that, it changes the water flow, it changes the temperature, the dissolved oxygen. It alters a lot for fish habitat and invertebrates. So that's one impact we're worried about. The other is, depending on where it gets pushed into, if it's like in an embayment, it could actually move across so thick you cannot get watercraft across it. That particular plant has all those little hairs. Those trap air underneath of it. There's actually documented records of boats getting lifted up onto the giant salvinia and not being able to get back off of the giant salvinia.
So how do you get rid of it? I mean,
So with all these species, there's sort of a management process we follow. So first is the detection. So we first find something that's there. Then next we do is what's called surveillance. So we'll go out and we start to search an area that we think logically is where that particular species is at. What we're trying to do is find out how widespread, how large of a population there is. If there's a large population, by default we fall back to what's called containment. So containment is we would put up barriers, we would restrict the movement of things in and out of there just to make sure nothing's spreading that plant or that species. If it's a low enough number, we can come in there and we do what's called a suppression. So we can come in and, in the case of a lot of plants, we can spray an herbicide and we can knock those numbers down and keep them from being spread or getting too numerous. There is a point on the curve, like for zebra mussels, where you start to do what's called site management. So zebra mussels, for those maybe don't know this, one of the major impacts is with hydropower or any kind of water infrastructure. A lot of what happens for the management of zebra mussels is site specific. It's at that pipe to make sure that it does not impact that water intake. But out from that, there is no management taking place. And zebra mussels have been here a very long time, and that's like the best poster child for when you get through this management curve, there's a place where there's nothing you can do. It's too widespread, too abundant, and too many ways for it to get back into an area. So you're not going to spend a whole lot of money to try to get it completely out of an area unless it's a small area and you can really block it off.
So what do the zebra mussels do again? I mean, that they're dangerous?
So they have quite a few impacts. So in the Great Lakes, they shift the water quality. So you actually have toxic blooms, a harmful algae, and you get fish kills. It's also dangerous for people and pets. They also, when they die, their shells are on the beach. Well, their shells are very sharp. So people on the beach actually cut their fingers or toes, things like that. You also have competition. So it's a filter feeder. It filters about a liter of water every couple of minutes based on about a 12 millimeter sized individual. There are examples of those being in fish tanks where it looks like chocolate milk, and then like within a day, it looks like it's spring water. Well, what that's doing is they remove everything out of the water. So there's nothing for anything else. So in high numbers, they're filtering out a lot of food resources for other things. So there's lots of impacts for zebra mussel. It is sort of if you go through the history of invasive species, it is the reason why there were several federal laws like the NAMPACA, NISA from the 1990s through 96, like a lot of revisions, a lot of national sort of organization of federal agencies to combat invasive species was directly because of the zebra mussel and the other one, which kind of sounds odd because they're all aquatic species except for the brown tree snake. So how many have heard of the brown tree snake? So it's an arboreal snake introduced into Guam during World War II. It was brought over with materials from Papua New Guinea. All this equipment was staged in Guam. The snake got out. It's arboreal. What's important about this is the snake actually moves up into the trees. It is nocturnal. It's known as a cat eye snake. So it has this, it can see at low light levels. Well, it literally would go through and just eat birds right off the tree branches. Because in Guam, there's no snakes. So the birds didn't see it as a threat. And so it literally wiped out like 98% of the birds. I think the rails left, the cocoa is left, and I think the Mariana crow may be left, but I think they've taken both those birds and they have breeding now in zoos and off island. So there's really no native birds left in Guam because of that snake. And it's just really odd, but that was directly related to military actions, and so it got pulled in as sort of an add-on with zebra mussels.
If you see that crow, like that lady found in December,
Yeah.
you just can't pick it up and get rid of it? I mean,
Oh, you can, yeah. She just happened to be very curious. She was walking the beach and just looked at it and said, like, I've never seen this before. If you were to hold giant Salvinia in your hand, the first thing you're gonna do is see on the bottom side is all these hairs. And you're gonna be like, that's like no plant I've ever seen. And she was just curious, and luckily, she was a member of iNaturalist. She took a picture, and like I said, it popped right up on my phone.
will it do anything to you, the person holding that?
No.
I mean, it's bad, I'm just curious.
Right. No, there's no human health issues with that particular plant.
Regarding the carp, is the mission total eradication or just manageable levels?
The end goal would be complete eradication. And in some systems, it is possible. You know, looking at Barkley and Kentucky reservoirs, where we just primarily see immigration from the Ohio River, no reproduction in those systems, we can get to a point of between natural mortality and commercial harvest to reduce the population down to eradicate them, or at least to a level at which is acceptable and manageable for our state agencies.
So you were talking about how you're seeing a trend of fewer juveniles and longer, heavier fish, which means, less competition, you could say. Does that indicate that you're making progress, or would you need more trend data to make that inference?
So those data points are indicating that we are fishing the populations down locally in the two reservoirs. We will continue to monitor those. A lot of the fish that have been removed in the last several years was due to one single year class of fish in 2015. That was prior to me being here with the department, but I've talked to many people that just described waves and waves of young of year fish coming through the locks and in the tailwaters in the fall of 2015. And we primarily have been tracking that cohort of fish through the systems, Barkley and Kentucky, but we do see fish younger than that are migrating in through those locks. And that's where the deterrent systems come into play there. The non-physical deterrence being only 50% effective, but 50% at that price point is a lot more implementable for us locally than other systems that they're using up in Chicago that are using a series of lock adaptations where they're flushing water out and they use electricity, and those systems operate at tens of millions of dollars annually versus the bioacoustic fish fence that is closer to $1 million at the state it is in now.
So they're electrocuting them?
They put an electric curtain in the water that prevents the fish from passing upstream. It actually, they have, it's a double redundancy, so there's actually 3 of those electric current systems that they have in place.
When this started, you could take a bow and arrow and go out and make $100 in a day, shooting the carp and taking them in for the bounty. Yeah. During COVID, there was a lot of people that capitalized on that. They had free time and they were able to harvest a lot of fish. And between that and the tourism folks that come in, that they are able to offset some of their travel expenses with the money they get from those harvested fish.
Yes, sir.
I'm really interested in that one kind of sound barrier slide. I've never really seen that before. What impact does that have on native species? I really think about the filter feeder like a paddlefish.
Sure. We did study several native species during that project. Paddlefish weren't really impacted by the bioacoustic fish fence. A lot of the native species don't have as sensitive a hearing, that inner ear apparatus, as the silver and bighead. The silver carp in particular, that hearing system is what causes them partially to get startled so much and then jump out of the water. And the other native species that we tagged, we had some lake sturgeon, blue suckers, buffalo drum. We all saw pretty consistent rates of passage versus on and off of that system. The paddlefish was a little, it didn't seem to affect them as much, but there might have been some trends that certain times of the year they were less likely to pass upstream at that system. So for long-term use, there could be some management actions where, we see more prevalence of an upstream push of the carp later in the summer, so the system could be turned off in the springtime when the native species are typically trying to migrate versus when the carp are migrating at a different direction here in Kentucky.
Do you guys see the day where every boat ramp's got to be inspected, sailing night or with the Coast Guard auxiliary when we talk about this stuff and we do vessel safety checks? But is it going to come to a point where we need to start checking vessels as they come from 5 different states to our region.
Yeah, I mean, so the question was about, do I ever see a point where we would be doing some kind of mandatory boat inspections at boat ramps? And, I like to say no. I like to think that, we can talk to folks, we can educate folks, and we can change behaviors. And try, yeah. But I will say that on the horizon, there is a species that's moving. So zebra mussels move from the Great Lakes in the eastern U.S. to the west. And so I worked on zebra mussels in the eastern U.S. It just so happened when I was out in California working out there that they showed up out there, quagga mussels and zebra mussels together. Now there's a species called the golden mussel that was introduced, we believe the genetics are from Brazil, into California, and it's spreading rapidly through all of their water conveyance infrastructure. But a few individuals now have been caught on boats. California has a mandatory boat inspection, and they caught some golden mussels on those vessels. It is very likely that in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see that mussel move from the west to the east. And if you've ever looked, there's some good maps online, but the amount of vessels and where they move, there's these heat maps they've done for the U.S. So you can look at like the Great Lakes to like parts of Kentucky. And then you can see from Kentucky to several different locations out west. And these maps are just crisscrossing, and it's vacation times, and people spend so many days in transit and then stopping off at multiple locations. So I do see this next species coming in and adding just another layer of trouble that we already have with, zebra mussels and quagga mussels, and now you're going to see the golden mussel. And the golden mussel is actually an estuarine species that is very adaptable to freshwater systems, but actually can tolerate polluted waters, because in most polluted waters, you see an increase in the salinity in those areas. And so it can tolerate very polluted areas. So again, I hope we don't have to do mandatory. Right now, I'd like the approach of education outreach. I will say that I've been looking at a lot of the non-resident fishing license data and things like that, of having people come from 5 states around, and it's not 1 or 2, it's 10,000 from this state, 12,000 from this state, and we don't know, those are day trips. We don't know what they're bringing with them. We don't know if they're bringing a boat. We don't know if they caught their bait or bought their bait somewhere in another state and brought it into Kentucky. We don't know if they're collecting their bait at site in Kentucky. There's a lot we just don't know, and that's a whole nother pathway that we're starting to work on. So the pathway is for a manager. That is what we focus on, because we can prescribe management techniques. We can look at doing inventories. We can do outreach and education. That's what we focus on. We can deal with a whole lot of species through one pathway in one location. So that's a lot of what I'm trying to do right now, is figure out where our highest risks are in the state and focus our limited resources there.
As a forester, we can't take firewood from one area to another. How is that really being checked? I mean, we're losing all of our ash trees right now.
Yeah, I mean, so the comment was about firewood and emerald ash borer. I mean, we have the terrestrial side. There are so many different issues with species, and what you find is a lot of those species, those donor areas I talk about, it's because of the climate matching. So if you think about, when I'm talking about Eurasia and Asia, and you kind of think about that part of the globe, if you look at the latitude line, those areas are very similar to us in the amount of daylight, precipitation. So it actually matches well with large parts of the U.S. And so this exchange back and forth of species is something that's been happening for a very long time. And we're seeing that with even our species going to those same areas. If you go to Japan, largemouth bass, I mean, that's a nightmare there. I was just reading a paper about largemouth bass in Africa just devastating streams, wiping out the native fauna there. So it's not one way. I don't want it to sound like, everybody's dumping things on us. This is because the globe is so connected now. There are so many of these pathways and ways things can move around, but we are getting smarter and we are figuring out management tools where we can focus in on some of these pathways in specific locations.
Well, I want to thank Jeffrey and Josh for their presentation. I want to thanks again.
Still waiting.